How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boil Eye Hobby Time. Today we're back in the wild imaginary west, and I'm making a diorama of a giant monster trespassing onto some guy's farm. I had a leftover wooden box, so I decided to use that as the base for this diorama. And once I had flipped that over and cut out a piece of foam to match the size, I glued the two pieces together using some foam-safe super glue. With the base figured out, I needed to make sure that the composition of the diorama would look good with my monster. You may recognize this monster from use in previous videos, but somehow it's acquired a wagon wheel since we last saw it. I also paid to have it professionally re-sculpted since the last time we saw it, and that is for something that I'm very excited to announce to you all next week. After marking out a spot where I wanted a fence to go, I broke out some balsa wood to make said fence. This piece right here was the same size as the post that was in the monster's hand, so I'll be using that to make the other posts. I cut a few more pieces all to the same size, then I weathered them accordingly and I dry fit them in place. But before gluing the posts down, I prepped the surface of the foam using a wire brush followed by a butane torch to give the foam a more cornfieldy texture. To be honest, I'm not very familiar with cornfieldy texture, but this seemed about right. I then used my X-Acto knife to carve out the fence post holes. I glued the posts in place. And one is obviously missing as it was just ripped out of the ground by the bipedal bison, but I made sure to include a hole for that. Next, I added the cross beams, and I trimmed all those to match the edge of the base before painting on some mud effects from Vallejo. And this mud textured paint will be the terrain paste that I use for this diorama. I used a palette knife to apply the mud, and once I had full coverage, I painted the remaining visible surfaces of the foam along the edges with some Mod Podge and paint so that nothing would melt when I apply spray paint later on. The last little thing to do before setting this thing aside to dry was to add some broken fence pieces. I threw some hot air on the base as a gentle nudge in the direction of drying, and then I set that aside to prep my crops. For the crops, I bought some long grass from Woodland Scenics, and I had a plan to make my life easier in the long run by pre-making some nice clean rows of corn. In hindsight, I realized this looks nothing like corn, and this method was not recommended on any of the packaging, but I thought it might work out. I sliced the long grass into medium grass, and then I laid it out in rows on some wax paper. I then used some tuft tack to cover the bottoms of every row of grass, one end to the other. I then made sure all of the grass was evenly stuck together at the base using a paintbrush and some isopropyl alcohol, and then I set that aside for 24 hours to dry. In the meantime, it was time to work on the figures. Obviously, I have the monster figured out, but I needed a farmer. I went and found the most indignant looking miniature that I could find that was also holding a gardening tool. This farmer has worked too long and too hard to let this bison steal any of his sweet corn. I then glued the man and the monster to some bases, which fit nicely into my painting handles, and I began priming them with the airbrush. While I paint these minis, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons as well as a backstory to this little scene. This monster is known by the locals as a plains shepherd, or just a shepherd. The large herds of bison that roam the grasslands west of the Mississippi are all accompanied by such a creature, which only becomes aggressive if something seems like a threat to the herd. In this case, as per my first video with the monster, a stagecoach traveling through the area happened to pass by too close and spooked the herd, causing the shepherd to react. After a long chase, the shepherd took out the stagecoach just a short distance from this man's farm, and the already disgruntled monster, hyped up on adrenaline, decided to continue its rampage. After tearing up part of the farmer's fence, the bison stopped and looked up at the farmer to gauge if he was a threat. Luckily for the farmer, he knows that a bison is more likely to attack you if you run away, and seeing that he did nothing to threaten the herd, the destruction of the fence should be, and keyword being should, be a fair enough warning to keep the shepherd from destroying the farmer and his farm. But this is a wild animal, and the outcome of this diorama at this point is a roll of the dice. After the base colors had been applied with the airbrush, I gave the shepherd some washes of thinned down oil paints, followed by an enamel pin wash in a few of the darkest areas. These are all techniques that I saw from Marco Fursoni of NJM. After the washes had dried, I broke out my wet palette and began doing some edge highlighting on all the little strands of hair, moving lighter and lighter the higher up on the bison that I got. The last few details to pick out on this monster were the horns and the eyes and the highlights on the wood, and my Shepherd of the Plains was done. And while it may not be the best miniature that's ever been painted, it's my miniature, and I'm really happy with it. After the minis, it was time to move back to the base, which was now fully dry. I gave it a quick prime of white, and then I returned the mud back to the color that it had been before the primer. I know it may seem a little bit silly to go from brown to white and back to brown again, but I wanted to be able to control the color of the brown. Also, the mud effects have a slight glossy sheen to them that I didn't like. After touching up those fences with some highlights, I gave the whole thing a coat of burnt oil umber wash and I dried it with a hairdryer. And after the mineral spirits had all evaporated, I was left with a nice matte finish. At this point, it had been almost 24 hours since I had prepped my long grass. It was time to bring that back and see what the results were. After gently removing the lines of green hair from the wax paper, I began applying them to the base, and shortly after putting a few rows on, I realized that it looked absolutely terrible. And I honestly can't believe that I thought that was going to look anything like corn. After sitting and pondering my choices for a little while, I decided to remove the Grinch's hair from this diorama and pivot to something that was a little more time intensive. I broke out some little plants from Diorama Presepe. I found these guys right here, which actually look far more like corn than the grass. I lined up some rows using a ruler, and I spaced out my corn stalks, which needed to all be planted by hand. I loaded up the underside of a miniature wargaming base with some scenic glue, and I dipped and planted each stalk of my cornfield one after another. And while this process did take a lot more time than the green hair, it was very satisfying, and the final results look far better in the end. I still plan on using all of the green grass strips that I glued together at some point in the future, probably for their intended use as grass. I then broke out my trusty black 4.0 and I cleaned up the sides of this diorama. The last thing to do was to glue the miniatures into their positions. And after that, I called it good. Before moving on to the final shots of my farm diorama, please take a moment to appreciate all of the farms submitted by my patrons. These are all from last month's art challenge. Huge thank you to all of the patrons who participated last month. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, next week I have a really fun announcement for you guys, so stay tuned for that. That is it for this video though. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week everyone. I'll see you next time.